Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Those of you who braved your way through the weather, the rain and the wind to get here. So thank you very much, and to those who are online. This is our next Deaf Legal Network meeting. It's been a while since our last one, so I think this is going to be a really nice session to get things kick-started again. And we have a fantastic panellist with us today. So if I just introduce who's with us, Ollie Percy, who's a barrister here at Garden Court. To the intro?
Absolutely not.
I think those of you in the room probably know Ollie from the previous Deaf Legal Network meetings, and I'm Matthew Banks. I'm also a barrister here at Garden Court. And we have with us Faye Paffley, who's the engagement manager at Advocate. And Faye, as I say, is the engagement manager. Advocate is the bar's pro bono charity, and she focuses on increasing volunteer involvement across the bar and encouraging more barristers to take on pro bono work. Faye leads on key projects including the pro bono framework and has played a central role in the coordination and delivery of Advocate's involvement in Pro Bono Week. Faye has 5 years of experience in the charity sector. She began her career as a prison offender manager after studying criminology at university. And then Faye later became the senior community connector, working on transformation project at Mind with Tower Hamlets, Newham and Redbridge in partnership with the NHS before joining Advocate in February of 2025. So what I thought we'd do to start with is have Faye talk to us about how Advocate might be able to, and will be able to, in fact, help the Deaf Legal Network and how we can bring deaf people together with barristers. So over to you, Faye.
Great, thank you very much. So my name's Faye, I'm the engagement manager at Advocate. For those of you who aren't aware, Advocate is the bar's pro bono national charity, and our main role is to link members of the public who either can't afford to access legal help or aren't entitled to legal aid with barristers who are willing to do it for free. So we are really, really lucky, and we have around 4,500 panel members signed up to our panel of volunteers across all areas of law, and we operate in all courts and tribunals across the country. So a little bit about how we work and how people can get involved. The main way that people would sign up to Advocate is we have an online form on our website. So people would sign up there. They can either do it themselves or they can do it with a practitioner who is willing to help them. And we'd ask for kind of the key information around the legal issue that they require support with. And we'd also ask for the relevant documentation that they need to provide us with. This will then be sent to our triage caseworker, who will review everything and make sure that we've got all of the relevant information. We do have a couple of requirements that we ask people to keep in mind when applying. The first one is we ask that the legal issue has at least a 3-week deadline, just so that we have time to process it and be able to find a barrister. We also ask that the individual can't afford to pay for that legal representation themselves and isn't entitled to legal aid. However, I would say that if there is a really urgent issue, something that might mean that somebody's going to be imprisoned, they might be at risk of losing their home or losing contact with their family members, we would urge you to still apply, and we will look at the case on a case-by-case basis, and then we can make a decision. And if we can't help you, then we'll be able to signpost you to other relevant organisations. So once we've received all of that information, and the triage caseworker is happy that we're not missing anything, we will then send it to somebody who we call our reviewers, who are our senior barristers. They're barristers of 7+ years call, and they specialise in the specific area of law. They will review the case, they'll look at the means, the merits, and just make sure that it is suitable for a barrister to use moving forward. And then once that's been approved and everybody's happy, then we would put it out to our fantastic volunteers. We have 2 ways of doing that. The first way is we send it out on our weekly case list. So every Wednesday we would send through kind of specialised case list to all of our volunteers. And then the second way is that we have a members panel on our website where people can go and browse all of the cases. We encourage people to look at all of the papers to make sure that they are happy with the piece of work that they're going to take on before they accept it. And then we kind of facilitate the relationship between the barrister and the person who's seeking that help. So I guess the kind of thing that I want to bring up here is around the deaf legal network. The specific pathway that we have in mind to advocate and how we want to try and help is for people who have in mind a barrister from the deaf legal network that they would like to help support them with their case. Then that barrister can come directly to advocate, and we will sort out all of the kind of back end things. We'll make sure that it's ready to go ahead and sort out the authorisation. However, if the member who's seeking help has not yet found a barrister, then we would encourage you to just come to us in the same way that I have explained previously. So just come to our website, fill out the form, and we will look at your case, review it, and kind of let you know the outcome. And if it's successful, put you through to a barrister who will be able to support you. Just a couple of other things that I wanted to touch on before I pass back over. We do have a scheme called the Pro Bono Expert Support Scheme. It's run in partnership with the National Pro Bono Centre and also Pro Bono Connect. And it basically does what it says on the tin. We try to find experts that will help support barristers who are taking on these cases free of charge. And one of the things that that we can access through this scheme is translators. And one of my colleagues, Emily, has been working quite closely in order to ensure that we have BSL interpreters who are able to support help seekers when they come through to advocate. And finally, as an organisation, we rely very heavily on email, which I appreciate won't be suitable for everybody, but we do try to make it accessible in that sense. So we don't regularly have phone calls with help seekers or clients that come to us. But we are always open to kind of how we can make it more accessible. And if anybody has any feedback on that, as an organisation, we want to try and improve, we want to make it better. So yeah, that is everything from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Faye. Ollie, did you want to talk about the kind of cases that would be suitable or potentially suitable to put through this route?
Yeah, for sure. So Garden Court coordinates a project called a School Inclusion Project, which we discussed in the previous Deaf Legal Network meeting. And for those who weren't there, the School Inclusion Project, or SIP, is a forum that brings together lawyers, so barristers or solicitors, frontline organisations such as the Communities Empowerment Network, which is a specialist school exclusion charity, and law centres and people with lived experience of exclusion. And we have sort of meetings a bit like this once a quarter, but we also have a referral pathway where cases are generally put into the Google group by Quorum Children's Legal Centre or a law centre that's had a individual approach them and provide a summary of what that individual needs in terms of representation, and then it goes around the Google group. And sometimes there are solicitors who are unable to take on those cases because it's very difficult to get legal aid for school exclusion related work. There's some progress on that matter, but it's still a work in progress and it's risky work for a solicitor to do and potentially unfunded. So what happens in quite a few cases is either a charity such as Quorum, which has grant funding, access to solicitors, or a law centre acts as solicitor, or those cases are taken on directly by barristers, and Faye's very helpfully talked through the sort of fast track process for getting authorisation from advocate. So, for example, I've had cases where, for those of you not familiar with how school exclusion works, is you have a hearing in front of the governor and then you have a sort of review panel in front of an independent body. And generally the cases I do are these independent review panel hearings. And the way it works is that I will see the case come in through the School Inclusion Project. It doesn't, or other volunteers through the School Inclusion Project who are barristers see these cases come in, or we get contacted outside of it, saying they need representation, please can you help us? And we can say yes in principle as long as we can get authorisation because we're not direct access qualified. So we need a waiver to act directly with the member of the public who needs representation. So in those cases, Advocate has been really speedy at providing the authorisation for me and others to take on those cases. because in school exclusion cases, it all happens very quickly. The hearings tend to be within 15, or hopefully should be within 15 school days of the request for them. So you're looking at 3 weeks. And so slightly tighter timescales than the usual advocate deadlines. And they tend to have been approved within a day or so, which is great, which means that those cases, which often include issues of disability discrimination, issues of race discrimination, public law issues, has the school in permanently excluding this child made a rational decision, has it complied with its policies, etc. And we, as barristers, take on those cases and effectively do the solicitor side of things, which is generally the more client-facing interaction. So we'll have a meeting with them, just discuss what the case is about, try and work out what the strategy is, and then also do the more traditional barrister side of things, which includes representation and making written and oral submissions. So that works, I think, pretty well as a model at the moment for the School Inclusion Project in helping barristers like me who are not direct access qualified, so ordinarily need to be instructed by a solicitor, because the way it works is in our profession is solicitors do the sort of client-facing work and take instruction from the client, and then they instruct us. The direct access waiver that you get from advocate allows barristers to do all of that work, and then you have authority to do that discrete piece of work, and then the file is closed. And I've done other cases which have been more long running with advocate. The one nice thing about school exclusion cases is they tend to be over and done quite quickly. Hopefully you get the result you want and you get the kid back into school. Often, sadly, doesn't happen. But it works also for those longer running relationships. And in some of the cases I've done from advocate, legal aid is available in principle, but not in practice. So I think that's one thing to be aware of. There may be, I know advocate says you should, if you can get legal aid, you shouldn't really be using the pro bono service, but there is quite a lot of problems with the legal aid system. For anyone who's in this room that works in legal aid, I can see several. One, it obviously doesn't cover a lot of areas of law. So if you're having a problem about, a breach of contract, etc., it's unlikely to be in scope for legal aid. Two, even where it's in scope and you qualify, as in you aren't earning too much money, for the areas of work I do, there just aren't very many legal aid solicitors still practicing. So especially if you're not in London or you're outside of a city or town which has a legal aid solicitor, you're going to be in real practical difficulty accessing someone. Education is one of my 8 main areas of law, and there's just a complete lack of education solicitors, unfortunately, who do legal aid work, because the legal aid rates are loss-making for those solicitors, which is something we should all be outraged about and do stuff about. But so advocate is available in those cases where, okay, in theory you might be able to get legal aid, but in practice you're not going to, because there are practical barriers to getting that legal aid. So yeah, I have found it a really positive experience. It's a different skill set for a barrister to be able to do that client care work. So we're not used to it as barristers, sort of meeting with clients and listening to everything firsthand about what they've been through. It's a really important skill, and it's one that actually most of us don't have, to put it bluntly. And it's a work in progress for me, and it's a work in progress for lots of barristers. I think we probably need to give some thought about how we do training when in developing this sort of fast track procedure and use of advocate for the Deaf Legal Network, because there's not going to be familiarity. We want as many barristers as possible to do this, right? But lots of barristers may be well intentioned, but sort of maybe not have enough understanding about basic client care, which is always a work in progress for, and doing the highly important job a solicitor normally does, but the specifics of representing deaf people. And we need, as a network, to think about how we get as many barristers as possible in a position where they can help. And it's not just barristers that do discrimination law, but actually who do the sort of landlord and tenant work and the breach of contract work, etc. All areas where there are practical barriers to deaf people accessing legal representation. So we need to give some thought to that, but that's kind of the purpose of these meetings, so that we can all discuss it and work out the practicalities of actually getting a model that works. We have a model that works for the school inclusion project, and I've represented deaf families through that, but probably we need to do something a bit more specialist and focused here. Yeah, that's my bit.
Thank you, Ollie. If I follow on then from Faye and Ollie, and if I talk a little bit more about the deaf side of things. So for those of you who don't know me in the room, I'm Matthew Banks. I'm a barrister here at Garden Court, but I'm also a qualified sign language interpreter. And I'm a coder insofar as both of my parents are profoundly deaf. That was the household I grew up in. So this is a passion project for me. The idea of everything that we've set up here with Advocate as well is because when we set this up and we had our initial meetings, we had a lot of deaf people in the room feedback to us that access to justice is a really big issue. Knowing where to turn is a really big issue. Knowing where to get accessibility for where to turn becomes an additional issue. And we heard quite passionate stories from people in the room wanting to do the basic legal activities we will all need to do in our lives at any given point in time, create a will, and being told that interpreters weren't available for that, there was no funding for that. I know we have a representative from Culver Law in the room who are doing that sort of work. But we did have people in the room who were saying that, and were saying that solicitors were turning around and saying, well, we can't provide you with an interpreter, but why don't you bring along your child or your whoever to facilitate communication? When actually, not only is that wildly inappropriate in and of itself, but when you're talking about who you're going to leave your estate to, I mean, it couldn't be more inappropriate. But these are genuine stories. These aren't hypothetical scenarios. These are experiences that deaf people have had and continue to have. And then in other areas, using disability discrimination as an example, we have the Equality Act. And a lot of deaf people, the deaf community, is aware of the Equality Act and the contents of the Equality Act. But again, where to turn to try to get that support for asserting their legal rights, or if their legal rights have been breached, has proven to be incredibly difficult. So what we're hoping to be able to do with the Deaf Legal Network, everything that we've heard from Faye with Advocate and Ollie giving a really good example of a template that we can use with the School Inclusion Project, is for deaf people, deaf-led organisations to be able to feed into this network and give us real examples of things that are happening, and for us to be able to give advice. That would be, I think, incredibly useful at the first instance. Now, clearly, having Advocate on board is wonderful, and I'm really pleased about that. But there are a couple of other things that need to be put in place to make that work. Interpreting support, I've already mentioned, is clearly something that's really important. Faye mentioned the expert pro bono support scheme. I had a meeting with the National Pro Bono Centre earlier this week, and they're really keen to put together a register of sign language interpreters who would be willing to give their time for free to assist on an initial conference or on an ongoing basis. I must say that that's not been topped and tailed yet. I need to speak to the National Register of Sign Language Interpreters, NRCPD, just to make sure that we don't tread on their toes. But I think that would be wonderful. The National Pro Bono Centre they literally share an office. I think that's all right to say.
Yeah.
They literally share an office with Advocate. So if a deaf person, for example, were to approach Advocate and say, this is something that I have and I'd really like to be paired with a barrister, Advocate not only would be able to search for a barrister, they'd be able to search for an interpreter to be able to provide that assistance as well. So I think that's really important. And then thirdly, it's the deaf organisations. And I think the deaf organisations, the deaf-led organisations, have a really big part to play. They are the natural landing ground for deaf individuals to turn to for support. And it would be excellent if we could create an environment of training circularly, holistically, where the deaf organisations can provide some training for the barristers and the legal representatives involved in this network. And the legal professionals can also provide some training to the deaf organisations in terms of how to manage in casework issues that land on their doorstep, and how we might be able to streamline a process whereby those organisations on behalf of an individual can approach the Deaf Legal Network with an issue that can then be resolved. We've obviously not had one of these meetings for a while, as I said at the start. We actually do have another meeting slated for April, so we're really looking to put some oomph behind this now. And I hope to be able to give a proper update in relation to that voluntary register of interpreters and the involvement of deaf organisations in the April meeting. That's really what I wanted to say, I think, just to add how that might work as a structure. I think what would be really good for people in the room and for people who are participating online is to hear from you as well, and any thoughts and suggestions, anything you want to add, and something that I'll talk about later, but I'll just mark the card now. It would be really good to have feedback from people as to whether there's a specific topic they would like to cover in April. So at the last meeting, for example, we did a deep dive into the Equality Act and relevant recent cases. If there's a specific topic that people would like us to cover, we can try and make sure that we get the appropriate speakers to talk to that issue in April. But Ollie, unless you've got any other thoughts, I think maybe we'll hand over to people to contribute. Hi, Amy.
Hi. Obviously, I was at the last meeting, and we spoke then mainly about the deaf discrimination issues. There is a network already going for what I call non-deaf discrimination, not deaf-specific issues, if you like, wills, probate, conveyancing. It's called the Advisors for Deaf Network. There's criteria that firms have to meet. At the moment, it's open to solicitors, accountants and financial advisors. The criteria includes that they have to have deaf awareness training, they have to have a VRS system and advertise the VRS system, because I've come across quite a few firms that have Sign Live, Sign Video combo, and it's not visible on any of their websites or anything. They have to use qualified interpreters. From my area of law, I'm a private client lawyer. What you absolutely don't do is even have the children in the room when you're taking instructions regarding wills. Never mind actually take the instructions from the children. It was brilliant during COVID, because the amount of phone calls I got from people going, "Mum can't get out, but she wants to write my brother out of a will. Is that okay?" No, it's not. And no, I'm not taking your instructions. And you still get it now. So why lawyers think that actually it's acceptable to have a family member interpreting for a will, I'm not going to lie, I have enough issues with interpreters not interpreting what I'm saying in a will meeting and putting words into the client's mouth without actually putting the family into it as well. So we have got this network running already. I'm not going to lie, it's like pulling teeth. I was just saying to this lady here, we've got various law firms that we've approached, and they've said, well, you give us the badge and then we'll put things in place. No. You put your things in place and then we'll give you a badge. But what we've also done is we've got supporters for the network Combo, Sign Video, I think Deaf Plus, BDA, who, what we want to do is have the supporters, i.e. the people who are experts in working with the deaf community, to support the financial advisors, the lawyers, the accountants who haven't got that experience. And we get a lot of queries from deaf people wanting certain areas of law. I'm not going to lie, we haven't had any real discrimination ones yet, or education. But we get a lot of, for example, family queries. And at the moment, we don't have a family lawyer in the network. And so I give them a name of family lawyers that I've worked with, and I'll say, I'm very happy to support in whatever way. And they come back and they go, they've told me they're going to charge me £300 to get an in-person interpreter for half an hour plus travel and all the rest of it. And I actually have to write back to the lawyers and say, this is the law, you will pay for the interpreter. And even when the deaf client has said that to the lawyers, they're still ignoring them. It's like you need that almost behind you to spell out what the law is. So we have got the start of a network. It could be expanded if you wanted to. We've, like I say, we've got the infrastructure, we've got the network, the website, we've got logos, we've got all the rest of it. If that's something that would potentially help, rather than starting from scratch, just a thought.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, part of the, as we see it, the purpose of these meetings is to avoid duplication, like to get everyone.
So I set this up because I thought, and maybe I misunderstood, but I thought this was more about like helping with deaf-specific legal issues rather than legal issues in the deaf community, if that makes sense. Whereas I've gone the other way, like the conveyancing, the everyday things that everybody needs, but deaf people struggle to access.
I mean, it sounds like complementary initiatives, and we can work out how one focuses on one and one focuses on the other, right? We don't want to be reinventing the wheel.
No.
We want to try and, like, there's not enough people doing this work. Let's, more the merrier, of course. I would note that I don't think barristers are members of those networks.
We're not at the moment. Because, so the reason it's set up as it is, it was obviously we're finding our way. We are a niche private client firm, so we do wills and probate, we do dispute work, and we do court protection. As a private client lawyer, I often use financial advisors and I use accountants. And when people get inheritances, they sometimes want that financial advice. So that's why it sort of has started where it started. The idea was that as it grows, and we wanted to grow organically, we can include possibly people like estate agents, you know, other services that the deaf community struggle to find. And the idea is you can go on, you can click, I need a lawyer in this area, find me one.
So I think that's something, as Ollie said, it sounds like it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive.
No.
And we might be very useful to signpost people. So that's really helpful. Thank you. There's been a question online which was just asking if I could mention more about the National Pro Bono Centre's liaison with barristers and interpreters. Where's the meeting in April planned to be, and what's the purpose of the meeting in April? So thank you for the question. I'm sorry if I wasn't clear on that. Advocate do the sort of liaising with barristers. What we're hoping the National Pro Bono Centre will be able to do specifically in relation to DLN is source the interpreters. So if we can place a deaf person with a barrister, we've still got the issue potentially of communication, and we're hoping that the National Pro Bono Centre will manage a list, a register of interpreters who are willing to give their time voluntarily. An email can go to that list, and hopefully we can place a barrister, an interpreter and a deaf individual to resolve whatever the issue is. The meeting in April will be here at Garden Court, and in terms of the purpose of the meeting, we will have 3 of these meetings a year. The overarching purpose of the Deaf Legal Network is on the website. I'll spare everybody reading all of that out, but I think the main purpose is to make sure that we get together and build some momentum. I think that's what's really important. If there's a big gap between these things, we're having to start things afresh again. So I'm really pleased that we have another one in April because we can keep that momentum going. In terms of how these meetings operate, I think it's nice to have a focus for a meeting. For example, I think today's focus is advocate how they can come in and how we compare deaf individuals with barristers. But it's also about reviving the initiative a little bit. I think what would be good at the next one, like we did at the last one, is to have a specific focus, for example, on the Equality Act, and we could do something similar to that and have speakers on there. And then I think it's always important to have time at the end for people to share experiences, what's going on, things that people would like to see happen, so that we can try and implement it, really. There is a will here from barristers. There is definitely a need within the deaf community, and the more that we can work together, we can try and provide something that will actually fill a gap, which I think has been pretty substantial for a long time. I hope that answers that question. There are no more questions online. Are there any other questions, observations, thoughts from people online or in the room?
What's the state of play with regards to bringing barristers in to be, basically knowledgeable enough to do the sort of work that we're talking about?
Yeah.
Ollie, do you want to answer?
Yeah, so that is obviously a really important point, because the average barrister is, as I mentioned, not even particularly good at client care necessarily, or doing the solicitor side of things. And then obviously there are exceptions, and lots of us are good at it, hopefully. But it's not the purpose of a barrister's job to do that initial solicitor side, and it's a specific skill. And then placed on top of that, the specific experience of working with deaf communities is really important. So ideally, we would want to put in place training for barristers that are going to be part of this network and volunteers who are going to be the kind of barristers that are approached to represent deaf people in, be it independent review panel hearings or whatever it might be. I think realistically, coming back to Amy's point, is the barristers that are going to be most interested, I would expect, are barristers that already have a practice in disability related work. I don't know that, but I would expect that to be the case. So I expect we are more likely to have volunteers with expertise in discrimination, we're in community care, in education, housing.
One of the reasons we set the network up was because I did get a query from somebody about a discrimination case. This was quite a few years ago now. And I found a solicitor's firm not a million miles away from here. And it said in big letters, deaf discrimination. I thought it was brilliant. I found the right people for this job. Fantastic, off you go. And this firm would only offer a telephone appointment.
Oh, no.
And I told them quite frequently if they start saying stuff online, because they still haven't changed their attitude. So I think it's actually being as well as saying that you're going to do it. They never. I emailed them and said, "You do realise what you've said," and they never replied. But it's actually getting people to understand that telephone isn't an option. I have a deaf colleague, and she will send an email that says, "Please email back. I am deaf," and they phone. We were trying to find a new office in a different thing. I think she had about 40 calls, having said, "Please do not telephone me." So it's getting people to actually understand the nuances of working with the deaf community rather than just like ticking that box, if you like.
Totally. And that's going to be a work in progress, because like one training session is not going to be enough to understand and help understand some basics, but not going to be sufficient. I think we probably need to put a call out to volunteers, right, amongst people who are at the bar. And so I don't know, Faye, how that might work.
Yeah, we can have a think about putting some comms out and see if there's people that specifically would be interested in attending training and kind of getting involved specifically in this network. And maybe we could speak to the National Pro Bono Centre as well about them facilitating training, because they've done training for barristers on different topics in the past. So yeah, maybe that's a conversation for me to take away and speak to Emily. But yeah, definitely, I think that's a good idea.
And I think in answering Bethan's question, I guess there are two ways of answering that in many ways. One is about the type of training that a barrister might need in terms of client care with a deaf person, the kind of issues that might arise in a factual matrix specifically to deaf people. And absolutely we should be providing some training, as Ollie and Faye have just said. And I think we can rely on deaf colleagues within deaf-led organisations to also want to provide some training, whether that be deaf awareness and things like that. There's also the separate issue, which is, as I said before, deaf people, just like anybody else, need to access exactly the same types of legal support as everybody else does. And from that point of view, a lot of the barristers are already suitably qualified to be able to provide their expertise. And in many ways, it's just about understanding, yes, it's a deaf client, and yes, there's adjustments that need to be made in terms of communications, how instructions are taken, for example. But ultimately, they need the expertise of lawyers just like anybody else does. And I think it's really important to debunk some of that as well, I think.
I agree with that. I think there is a problem in the legal sector about lack of expertise in the substance of the law on goods and services discrimination. Very few goods and services county court discrimination claims are brought. That's primarily a funding related issue, because the way it works, if you've got a relatively low level disability discrimination claim, it's often not financially worth paying for a solicitor to do that work for you, because if you're stuck in a small claims track, you're not getting your costs back. So if you spend a chunk of money on, so sort of without wanting to trivialise, there are different sort of levels of discrimination, the sort of all of which need to be challenged, but the way that damages are assessed, there's a lower level band, there's a middle level band, and there's a higher level band. And all of that needs challenging, but if it falls in the lower level band, the cost benefit of instructing a lawyer privately to challenge that is generally not worth it. That means, because there isn't a sort of culture of bringing these claims. There isn't shared knowledge or expertise in bringing these claims, and it means there's a sort of skills deficit in both the solicitor and barrister side of the profession of it. So
it's also a David and Goliath thing as well.
totally.
As a personal example, I'm bringing a claim at the moment against the people that built my house, and they just keep stalling me because, you know, I haven't got an endless pot of money and they don't want to fix my house. And I think it's the same sort of thing. It's like you just keep ignoring people or sending them sort of piecemeal emails, they'll just go away. So it's an added stress on top of the discrimination and the fact that they've still got to find that service or that goods that was defective in the first place.
Totally. But I think it's not just deaf people that this is a problem for, the goods and services issue. Yeah. It's a real problem, and it's a real problem with the legal aid agency, because the legal aid agency also adopts this cost-benefit criteria in determining whether to grant funding. So it means that the Equality Act has become a little bit of a dead letter for goods and services claims, where it's really nasty, but it probably would fall within the lower band because it's a one-off incident, and you're not going to get more than 10 grand for that one-off incident of discrimination. So the legal aid agency is going to say, well, it's just you, it's not a wider public interest claim, it's The cost of getting a solicitor and doing all of this work is just not going to justify our involvement. There is an advantage if it stays in the small claims track, is that you're not at cost risk either. So if you've got pro bono legal representation and you can get a waiver for court fees or whatever, you can enforce it, and pro bono plays a really valuable role in those kind of cases. So I would be keen for us to do a sort of specific piece of work around sharing expertise in bringing those claims, and sometimes they will be worth a lot more because you will have experienced discrimination over months and months and months, and it will be really invidious and long lasting, and it will get into the higher bands. But there's just not this, there is a skills deficit, unfortunately, in the legal profession. And so if we can do something about that, that would be great too.
And that sounds to me to be the exact kind of case that might be really beneficial to go through this setup that we've just explained. It will give barristers an opportunity to educate themselves, work on the substance of the Equality Act and how to bring goods and services claims. And ultimately, I think what we all know in terms of these types of cases is that if no one ever asserts their rights are being breached, then the people doing the breaching will continue breaching because it's not in their interest to have to make any changes. So that's exactly the type of case that I think would be really beneficial through this route and this framework. I've certainly worked on some cases fairly recently for the discrimination type cases with banks, discrimination type cases with other organisations that fundamentally don't recognise the need to make reasonable adjustment, for example, or indirect discrimination type claims. And unless and until people are going to assert rights that these are being breached, those organisations aren't going to make those changes. So that's the incentive that we need, I think.
Would part of it be educating the deaf community themselves?
Totally.
I'm just wondering if we have barristers that are wanting to get involved in the network, if they might be willing to go and give presentations to some of the deaf organisations, charities, coffee mornings, because that's when people start to learn what their rights are. And actually, when they're sat together and you say, oh, this happened to me, that happened to me, that's when, and you find out it's the same organisation, they're more likely to start to bring claims.
I definitely think that is something we need to explore because generally if an organisation is being horrible to one person, they're doing it to a lot of people. There's a wider problem in sharing that.
Mornings I've been to, and I still go to, they often have presenters, and there's all manner of different things. And it's seeing as hearing people, there are certain words that we hear, and we may not fully understand them, but the deaf community haven't even come across them until they're properly fully explained. And so if we can sort of break down those barriers from both ways, so you get the barristers wanting to help, but actually the deaf community asserting their own rights, then we might start to get somewhere.
I agree, and I think that's where the deaf organisations have a really important role to play. I've got a couple of questions online, so a couple of comments as well as a question. So one, they're making the point that it's not really an issue of stepping on the toes of the National Register of Sign Language Interpreters by setting up a pro bono list, that the National Register will most likely welcome this aspect. Let me just say I completely agree with that. I have had informal conversations, and I know that they're very keen for this to be able to happen. I just didn't want to say that it is going to happen until that's been topped and tailed with them, but that's a very good point. The second is that the Advisors for Deaf Network, which has been spoken about here by Amy, has a slightly different purpose, isn't quite the same as the Deaf Legal Network. I'd agree with that, and that's why we think they can sit alongside each other. Could we set up a visual map of what the relationship is between the Deaf Legal Network, Advocate, the National Pro Bono Service, some kind of flow chart as well aligned to that as to how some cases or issues might be referred or signposted elsewhere. And this will really help outline what the Deaf Legal Network's purpose is. I completely agree with that. We will take that away and do some kind of visual chart as to how a referral might look, who the different people are, and we can disseminate that to everybody that's currently on our mailing list. I think that's a really important point, and a visual one obviously helps in more ways than one. Somebody else has asked that they have a client that's making a claim in the employment tribunal. They've done this with a bit of help from CAB, but that's it. No advice or guidance or representation. They're waiting for an intermediary assessment ordered by the judge. Meanwhile, are there any pro bono barristers or solicitors that may be able to help? Well, I think this is a great example of a referral that could be made to Advocate. I'm trying to think how we're going to progress this. Are we going to set up a Google? I think if we set up a Google group, what we might have to do is, I'm trying to think of GDPR, we might have to send out a message to everyone on our current mailing list to opt in to being put onto that Google group. And if people do that, we can then share resources and information. And one of the things that we can do straight away is to share the web link from Advocate, how to get in contact with them and their form. But what it sounds like in this particular case, if you're filling the form on Advocate, Advocate will try their best to be able to pair this person up with a barrister.
I'm Helen, for those who I haven't met. I'm a solicitor at Dighton Pearce Glynn, which is a public law firm, together with my colleague Lily. And public law basically means we challenge government decisions, so quite different to what Amy does with the private client. Ours is much more against either local authorities, or we work a lot against the Home Office, so on behalf of asylum seekers or migrants who don't have visas yet. And Lily and I have been representing quite a few deaf asylum seekers recently, and that's been quite interesting. But I guess I wanted to pick up on the discussion around the Equality Act, because and the idea of sort of giving deaf people or deaf-led organisations the tools to sort of further their legal matter as much as they can themselves as well, because one of the things that our firm does is to provide templates for the type of kind of legal letters that people or charities can manage to send themselves, to kind of take them just that step further, which sometimes can resolve an issue or sometimes can just do that first step to get a response that makes it more likely that you can get a solicitor at that point. So within my world, those are called like reaction letters. But I was having an email back and forth with a deaf client, well, a former deaf client today, and the issue they were trying to resolve was that their GP was not organising BSL interpretation, despite just endless emails saying you've got to do this, and then sort of saying we will do it, and then just, you know, for a year not doing it. And I ended up sort of drafting to them, send them this email. So I sort of wrote a quick complaint, and I was like, send them this, and if that doesn't sort it, then I'll take on the case. Because for me as a solicitor, it's like, I will take it on and I want to take it on, but if it can get resolved with like quite a strong, assertive, this is what the Equality Act says, if you don't do this, a solicitor's going to get involved. If that can sort it, that's better. It's faster for them and it's better for me as well. So it made me think, if there was resources available to people for issues that are encountered constantly, whether they're with banks or with GPs or with, you know, we could probably put together, these are some really high frequent issues that people are facing, to sort of equip people with, here's a one-page template, just explaining the Equality Act or what the NHS guidance says about you must provide interpreters, don't ask family members to do it, your appointments shouldn't be delayed unnecessarily, by the fact that you need to arrange interpreters. It is your job to do this. It might help that deaf person to say, actually, I can slightly amend that letter and send it off, rather than not quite knowing where to start or feeling like you're banging your head against the wall, to sort of come in between in that circumstance a little bit. And maybe those resources already exist. They're not necessarily deaf specific. So possibly they already exist, or possibly it wouldn't take that much work, I think, to repurpose things we already have into sort of anonymized template for people to use.
And Helen, would you see those letters as being open to anyone to just download, maybe from like DLN's website or someone else's website? Or would that be something that a deaf-led organisation might send on someone's behalf, or maybe a mix of both? Or...
Yeah, I mean, the way that we do it for our other work is that we have a website where they're hosted, the templates are hosted, and it's charities or the people helping those people can do like a short training to make sure they know the minimum, sort of from a due diligence perspective, in order to fill them out accurately. And then they can get the templates. In that case, DPG actually like quality assures some of the templates, so they send them in to us and we just check that it's right legally before they then send them out. So that's the kind of system we have for our, this is mostly to do with the Asylum Accommodation System and the Care Act, but also the Children Act. That's kind of our system working with charities, but I think it could be however it was sort of felt best, whether you just give the templates and they can send them off, or whether they're more complicated and you actually need some level of oversight from a lawyer to check that it's correct.
Sorry, briefly. Yeah, so DPG's PAC project is really brilliant, and we copied it. SOS SEN copied it for a sort of special educational needs version of that, not a Quality Act, but like children with education healthcare plans not getting the provision. It's not the most legally complicated because there's an absolute duty to secure it. So that operated for a number of years. Funding has just run out, but hoping to get it back up online again. I think that is a really interesting sort of model, because legal aid for this for private law or county court Equality Act claims is really tricky, in the same way that legal help is really tricky for the initial stages of judicial review work, because it's badly funded, and massively increases the impact of a letter being sent out if it's a legally accurate and thorough letter, especially if it complies with the formal pre-action process, which means claim is coming. This is not just a complaint going into the ether. It's like first stage of bringing litigation, next stage is lodging the claim and costs hit you. So I think that's something we should definitely be thinking about, how that would work. I'm conscious we shouldn't, that's quite a sophisticated piece of work to put together something like DPG's PAC project, but that would be amazing if that's something we could work towards.
I mean, it would be incredible. I think it would be really good to canvass the level of interest in deaf organisations. And if there is that level of interest, it may well be that to put together a toolkit, as you say, where that first step can be taken, that initial advocacy can be taken by the deaf organisations or by the individual themselves. And if there is a response that is completely incompatible with the obligations placed on whoever it's been complained to, for the next step to be to then, as you say, either come back to you or come to the Deaf Legal Network and put it through the funnel with Advocate or whatever it might be. But I think you've hit the nail on a really important head, which is that to empower the community and representatives of the community to be able to do that initial advocacy is really important. But there's usually a gap in saying, well, you need to do ABC. What you're saying is, we'll help you do the ABC bit. And I maybe I can talk to you after the meeting and we can give some thought as to how we might contact the deaf organisations with, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but with an offer of some sort.
Yeah.
That would be great.
Yeah, and I can go back to the DPG about, depending on what the letters were about, whether we could host them on our site and make them accessible there, or it might be that there's another law firm that does kind of more core discrimination work. Maybe they would be, there's probably different options of how to make them available.
Yes, and I think what the Deaf Legal Network can do is signpost to where they are, because again, if it's a deaf asylum seeker, for example, that needs the kind of help that DPG is already doing, we can signpost there. If it is a discrimination type case, then maybe it's another firm, or maybe the deaf orgs themselves can have a toolkit that they share. I don't know.
Yeah, I think we definitely need to have a think about the logistics of it, because the Equality Act is quite complicated, right? And there is a tension between sending out lots of letters and massively increasing enforcement, with also making sure you've got the supervision in place to make sure it's accurate, etc. And it's definitely something that can be achieved, I'm sure, but there's a piece of work that needs to be done, and whether that's a case of us going and speaking to the Equality and Human Rights Commission to see if there's some funding available, or another sort of grant funder to see if there's some funding available, so that actually, like, an expert discrimination solicitors can put the time in to write those templates that's funded, I think is a piece of work that we need to be doing, because it's all great saying people are going to do stuff pro bono, but actually no one should be doing pro bono work if the system works properly, right? The legal aid system should work effectively to mean that issues were covered by legal aid, where legal aid is available. And legal aid is available for discrimination claims, in theory. Getting it available in practice, it requires some work. But I definitely think an action point to take away from this meeting is for us to have a discussion out of here about, to what extent could a PAC project, which is the sort of project that DPG runs, work in this setting? What would be required in terms of funding to get it off the ground? Who would be involved in it? And what are the actual next steps to sort of progressing it? And I think it's a slight chicken and egg situation. Obviously, it would be good to have funding available now to start doing the work and scoping it out, but we'll probably need to do a bit of scoping out before we can get some funding. But it seems to me that nuts and bolts, goods and services discrimination claims from banks, doctors, surgeries, whatever, like frontline services, are particularly annoying and discriminatory, would be the ones to prioritise, and maybe a piece of work that's the members of DLN and the deaf organisations can help us with, apart from delivering it, is actually identifying where the common issues are. So we focus our energies on the ones that are actually the most frequent, and it's led by people with lived experience so we're not writing template letters on something that's actually not a problem in practice, because, I don't know, some sectors are actually quite good, versus other areas which are not.
Yeah, and I think just as an overarching point, this is probably not lost on anybody, but at no point in trying to put together this deaf legal network are we saying that we have a silver bullet for anything. But I think what we're trying to do is say there are professionals here with a genuine will and an interest to put the groundwork in, and deaf people for so long have felt that the legal profession is completely out of sight, out of touch, no way to get in contact. So I think what I'd really urge people to do is share that we're here, that we're doing this, the will is there. It might take us a bit of time, it might need to be organic, and we might make some mistakes along the way, but there is genuine will goodwill here and good brains. And if we can come together and try and make this work, we could make a really big difference. Sorry, that's very high and mighty, but I felt like I should say that. We've got a couple of questions online. A controversial one that might be interesting just to see what people's thoughts are. Do deaf defendants face risk of poorer legal representation because of legal aid pressures or because of a lack of deaf awareness among barristers? I don't know if that's really something we can answer, but I'm putting the question out because it's been put in the group. Maybe I'll have a stab at that. Legal aid pressures, I think, affect everybody across the board. In terms of a lack of deaf awareness, yes, I have no problem saying that. I think if people don't really understand the kinds of issues that deaf people face, the question implies a sort of criminal case. If there's some kind of mitigating factor that might be relevant to deafness that a barrister doesn't know about because they have a lack of deaf awareness, then yes, of course, it's possible. I would hope that barristers would try their best to educate themselves. What I would say about the Deaf Legal Network is it's also an opportunity to share some of this best practice. We just have to think about where to host it. So if I give you one example linked to crime, the rates within the legal aid agency for interpreters is set at a rate that is significantly lower than sign language interpreters charge. But the legal aid agency does have a separate rate for signers. They don't call sign language interpreters, they call them signers. And the rate for signers is significantly higher than the rate for interpreters. And unless you know that, the amount of criminal solicitors that for the first time they get a deaf client and they need to arrange interpreters, they're asking for interpreters, the person they're speaking to at the legal aid agency isn't aware of a completely separate line for signers. It's just all bundled in with spoken language interpreters, and the fee is different. And until somebody can say to them, ask them what the rate is for signers, and they check, you're going to have this problem all the way through. And the amount of interpreters through my interpreter networks that have come to me and said, you know, the solicitors are saying they can only pay X. And I've said, go back and tell them to get in contact with the legal aid agency and ask them for the budget for a signer, and it solves the problem. We just need to host that kind of information and share it somewhere. It's not a secret, but the problem is if you don't know it, you don't know it.
That wouldn't have even crossed my mind.
No.
Yeah.
We have a long question, actually, and I don't think you'll mind me saying his name. He was one of our previous panellists, David Buxton, who brought a judicial review against the Department for Work and Pensions about the legality of a cap that was placed on access to work funding. And he has sent a large question, and in terms of how long that is, I might talk to David outside of this, but I do think what I will raise is an interesting overarching point, which is strategic litigation and how deaf people, deaf organisations and lawyers think collectively about strategic litigation for big ticket items. So for example, there is a consultation underway right now within the Department for Work and Pensions for significant reform of the Access to Work scheme, which is likely going to amount in significant cuts. And I know that people are primed to take that for judicial review, not least because the feeling is that an equality impact assessment hasn't been done. Is the Deaf Legal Network an appropriate forum for strategic litigation to be discussed? Let me give an example. We know that the worst thing that could possibly happen is that 3 judicial reviews get lodged by 3 different deaf organisations within a week of each other, absolutely unaware to the others. That's a complete waste of time, effort, resource. So is the Deaf Legal Network an appropriate forum to discuss strategic litigation?
I think potentially, but organically, right? The School Inclusion Project our next meeting is specifically on strategic litigation, but we've had like, I don't know, 7 or 8 of those meetings because it's been going for years or like now. So we've got to the stage where that feels like an organic thing to do and expressly talk about, and there has been a lot of litigation that has come out from the school inclusion project, which has been interesting and good as lawyers who like doing that work. But the driver behind the school inclusion project, and I think similar here hopefully, is it will be led by people with lived experience about what the important issues are to try and litigate. And so our next meeting, the school inclusion project, we have, for example, someone from Special Needs Jungle talking about their own experience in segregation in schools and what we can do about it. We have someone from Traveller Movement talking about their sort of frontline advocacy in relation to Romani Gypsy and Irish Traveller children and what they're seeing on the ground, with a view to the lawyers in the room helping them work out, actually, is there a case on potentially some of those issues. So that could be something we do here, but I guess this meeting is about getting this back on the road and building some momentum. When we've got a bit more of the foundations in place, hopefully we can do some of that kind of stuff, because as we were discussing earlier, one of the key, and as Matthew's repeatedly mentioned, one of the key things here is to avoid duplication. So we don't really want there's not much resource going around. We want to be using it as sort of strategically, I kind of hate that word, but we want to be using it as sensibly as possible and maximising the impact that we can have. And that if one organisation is working on a challenge and another organisation is working on basically the same challenge and they're not talking to each other, that's a waste of resource. And we would love to be a way of facilitating conversations about that, so that it's like a collaborative and sensible way of making the most impact in this space.
Just a question about funding. I'm sure you might have done this already, but I'm just thinking about relying on the goodwill of people to provide their time voluntarily, which is hugely problematic, but more accepted within the legal system. I'm just thinking about interpreters especially. I don't know if Advocate has the option to source funding for that, or if you could, or if you have already discussed with deaf organisations who will have their own sources of funding and could maybe ring fence a certain amount that could be, you were saying about talking to the list of people who are happy to interpret voluntarily, but maybe prior to that there could be an avenue to go via some organisations and see, we've got this case, it's probably going to take X number of hours, can you offer us funding for that many hours interpreting?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I think that's definitely a good point. I think without more, that's the position that we're in, but I think there's a lot more that we can start to do, and I think until it's kind of off the ground, we won't see it happening. I think one of the things about this as well, when we talk about the Advocate system, some cases will just be exclusively pro bono. There's never going to be any funding available for it. And yes, can we see in cases like that, for example, can we apply to some pots of money to cover interpreters' time? There will be other cases that as soon as it becomes obvious it could be on a different sort of track, with solicitors, then I think everybody should be getting paid. I don't think we should be asking anybody, including interpreters, to be working for free if it's unnecessary. I also think, and I had a conversation with a leader of a deaf organisation about this week, which is his view is this is where deaf organisations can really help, because often they have interpreters in the office. So if a deaf person is going to come into the office, then rather than Advocate having to go out to a list of interpreters willing to give their time for free, it may well be that that organisation can redeploy interpreting provision already paid for to assist. So I think there are lots of creative ways that we can solve that issue.
Could we approach Convo, Sign Video, Sign Well, Interpreting Matters, the like, as maybe to, for them to donate some interpreting time?
I think the answer to that, I'm sorry to cut across you, I think the answer to that is definitely, but we've definitely got to put some kind of plan in place because all of the, and I've thought the same, I've got good relationships with all of those organisations and I think they're all things that we can do once we get going, but really good addition. We should rely on the whole ecosystem. So yeah. I have more questions here, but are there any more questions in the room? Just going back to David's question, and I missed a point on something that he said, that there is a lack of litigation, he says, in deaf-related issues, especially against government departments, in terms of their policies, and he makes the point that given that we have established public law principles of procedural fairness, consistency, transparency, etc., why do we think that there is a lack of, in particular, deaf litigation? Is that due to risks of cost risk? Is it structural barriers faced by deaf people? Are there any thoughts on that particular issue? It's a very meaty one that maybe we'll talk about another time.
Yeah, I imagine David has a better understanding of the barriers than pretty much anyone else. So all of those sound like good points. I think probably one of the things we want to sort of achieve through this network is break down a barrier between lawyers and deaf communities, right? And I used to work at an organisation called Public Law Project, which and we had this project which worked with frontline organisations, not deaf organisations specifically, but the focus of this project was to explain to these frontline organisations that everything from like Gypsy Traveller Rights to women's refuge centres, etc., who are seeing unfairness from the state on a day-to-day basis, how to identify how that unfairness could be challenged through judicial review, which is the sort of public law work that Helen and her colleagues do, and how you overcome the barriers to actually bringing that litigation. So one of the big fun issues is funding, and we had people speaking about funding at the last meeting that we had, and it's something we need to keep on the agenda constantly, I think, about how we actually fund litigation. We had Law for Change speaking last time. They're a strategic litigation funder, but there's legal aid available. So Esther from Erwin Mitchell spoke about that. And the Equality and Human Rights Commission has lots of funding, and Abby Hamer from the EHRC spoke about that. So funding is definitely an issue, but actually, if there's a piece of training that we can do for deaf-led organisations about seeing the barriers that are on the ground, that deaf people experience on the ground as public law issues, and one of my colleagues at PLP was like, if it smells bad, it's probably a public law error of some kind. Like, it's not a particularly sophisticated legal analysis, but it's not, that's generally quite a good starting point. If it feels wrong and smells bad, it's probably worth bringing it to someone to discuss further. And you never know, you might find that other people are experiencing the same issue, and therefore actually it's a wider systemic problem. Or lawyers in the room could be like, hang on, yeah, that's not just unfair, that's like, they haven't consulted lawfully here, like that's a judicial review challenge. So I really hope that this forum can be a space for that kind of thing and breaking down the barriers.
There's a question here about what other problems are related to deaf people and what other laws that relate to deaf people could. I'll just answer that very quickly in the sense that I think deaf people encounter all of the same problems as the rest of us, but of course they also have additional barriers on top of that, which is what we're trying to resolve. We have a question, would the Deaf Legal Network identify an issue which in their opinion needs action or further legal action? Access to work cuts has been referenced, seems to be an example of a concern that could feasibly lead to a judicial review. Or will the Deaf Legal Network be demand driven by deaf people coming forward rather than identifying issues that need challenging?
I think we want to be driven by people with lived experience, right? It's not for me as like a hearing barrister to be like, I really want to run this point. Can I find a client, please? That's not what we're about. Wants to be led by a deaf community. I'm not part of that. Solicitors here aren't part of, many of them are not part of that. We want to know what the practical barriers are on the ground, and hopefully it's a two-way learning. We can impart knowledge about discrimination law, public law, whatever it might be, but we really want to sort of get a better understanding of what the practical barriers are, and then we can sort of work collaboratively to glue it together to work out, actually, this is a problem, okay, that's a public law problem, and maybe we can actually get a case off the ground on this, rather than us sort of
presenting
exactly,
ideas.
that just doesn't work.
All I would say in addition, I completely 100% agree with Ollie. I would just say that the Deaf Legal Network also includes those deaf organisations and deaf individuals. So I think absolutely it could be led by the network, but I think the voices leading those sorts of things should be the deaf voices, and I think the lawyers involved can come up with ideas as to what legal avenues of redress might be available for those particular issues. There's a point being made in here just about being cautious about the kind of advice being given by who, and that there's transparency about what their involvement is, which relates to some previous difficulties, I think, with some deaf organisations giving advice that turned out not to be good advice. I think that's right, but actually all I would say to that is the concept of having the network should mitigate against those sorts of things, because actually we can bring in the right professionals with the right experience and expertise and provide really good quality training, hopefully. So I think actually the Deaf Legal Network can act as a mitigator for those sorts of concerns. I'm going to give everyone an opportunity, if there's no more, that we'll wind this up, not least because I've got at least three and a bit sides of notes for stuff to take away, that hopefully we can come back in April and really start feeding back what we have already progressed off the back of this meeting. So I look forward, please do come in April. I think the more we have that consistency of engagement, the more progress we can make. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our brilliant interpreter.
Yes, sorry, I should remember that, shouldn't I? Thank you, Liam and Eddie, for your work this evening. Thank you very much.